Both cases raise questions about the culture of celebrity in American news, the criticism that powerful media conglomerates are branding journalists to become part of the story while perhaps failing to pursue meaningful, relevant stories. Joining us now is Simon Marks. He's President and Chief Correspondent of Feature Story News. Also with us is Richard Fowler. He's host of the US syndicated talk radio program, The Richard Fowler Show. Both of you, thanks for joining us. Simon, you and I used to work together. That's full disclosure there. You're a Brit, but you've been here in Washington for a long time. What hit you so much about the Brian Williams saga?
I think, frankly, the sense of inevitability about it. I've been here for 23 years, and I have watched the steady, ongoing decline of the three main broadcast networks here as sources of news. And it isn't just a question of networks that have embraced this concept more of show business and infotainment and less of journalism. It is the direct corollary of a decision by these networks to abandon any pretense of public service broadcasting. You know, when on his first day as president of CBS News many years ago, the then president of CBS News, in a little noted remark, gave an interview and said, the CBS Evening News cannot even aspire to be a program of record. That's an astonishing development for a network program that used to be anchored by the most trusted man in America, Walter Cronkite.
Richard Fowler, do you think it was inevitable that something like this would happen with someone like Brian Williams, given the state of network news in the US?
Well, I think there's a big distinction between the two stories highlighted, right? You have the Brian Williams story and the Bill O'Reilly. Brian Williams is a journalist. Not saying that Bill O'Reilly is not a journalist, but at the same time, there's a difference here. His job is to sit at the nightly news and report the news of record, and Bill O'Reilly's job is to report the news of record and also give opinion, right? And as part of the blur between punditry and news makes it okay for O'Reilly, but not okay for Brian Williams.
But Bill O'Reilly was a network news correspondent when he made these mistakes. Should he still be held to account?
Well, I mean, I think it's a different network. It's a different time. I think it's fine, and I think you see Fox is not making any decision to, you know, get rid of him anytime soon. But here's the thing. I think the most important thing to realize is I think that this is a little bit, don't get me wrong, I think in the heat of war and in the heat of really, really bad decision, and in the heat of, you know, crazy climactic climates, right? News anchors are sort of put in situations where they don't remember all the pieces of a story. And I mean, that's just everyday life for everyday people.
Was that true?
I'm going to take issue with that, Richard. I mean, Nathan, you and I have both been in circumstances where it's often tough to report. I don't think you forget whether your helicopter came under fire or whether the one that was 30 minutes ahead of you came under fire. But I do agree with Richard that I think there is a distinction between the case of Bill O'Reilly and the case of Brian Williams, and that partly goes again to this issue of public service broadcasting. If you talk to the people who run the Fox News channel, they will tell you, and they have been very forthright about this, they do not believe that they have a public service mandate. They're a commercial broadcaster operating a commercial cable channel. NBC has a pretense of being a public service broadcaster, and it is broadcasting over the public airwaves, and there's a real distinction there.
What about the celebrity nature of the Brian Williams case, for example? Go back to that 2003 report. He was already being groomed to take over in the anchor chair. My favourite media critic, who unfortunately died, David Carr of the New York Times, said you could see from that original report the dark arts of television making, trying to put Brian Williams front and centre of a story. Is this part of the problem, creating a celebrity out of journalists so they actually become more celebrity than journalists? Richard?
Well, I think there is, you know, where there's smoke, there's fire, and I think you're onto something. There is a problem where our journalists who are sitting at the nightly news desk are sort of meant to be anchors, but herein lies the problem. In the battle for ratings, which is what this is all about, it's about advertising dollars and what you're bringing in, and also given the fact that our media has changed, or the media landscape has changed completely, beyond the fact that you have, now, it used to be appointment television, watching 6 o'clock news, now you have Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Huffington Post Live, you have tons of places to get your news, so now network news is forced to compete, and that's where the personality comes in, that's where the personality piece is so important, because people, when they like appointment television, they're like, well, I like Brian Williams, so I'm going to watch Brian Williams, and that's what leads to the embellishment in this particular case.
There is nothing inherently contradictory, though, about being a personality on television but also being a good journalist. There have been lots of those in the past that have managed to meld the two. Well, I mean, I would argue Peter Jennings, the late Peter Jennings from ABC, who managed to very carefully walk that line, an incredibly strong journalist, but also arguably one of the strongest personalities the country's ever seen on the air.
But I think here's the thing. I think there's a distinction now because Peter Jennings he was competing against CBS and NBC. Now we're competing against news coming from all different sources and trying to reach into when you talk about the coveted numbers in the demographic, so 25 to 54-year-old Americans, you've got to find different ways to get them. And so what happens is you lead to a situation where you have more sensationalization in your news to get to them.
That's obviously a very good point. We've seen the landscape of news change a lot. But what about journalists? You know, everyone's a journalist these days on Twitter and the like. But someone like Brian Williams was meant to be groomed for, you know, and have a lot of pedigree. Are we rushing to promote celebrities into these chairs? Are they not having the same experiences that they would have done, the same length of career in the field, Simon?
You're partly rushing to promote, but you're also creating an inevitability about a distance that exists between Brian Williams being paid $10 million a year to read the news, Diane Sawyer being paid at the time that she was anchoring $12 million a year to read the news, and the members of the public that they are supposed to serve. If you're being paid $12 million a year to anchor ABC World News, how do you then, with a straight face, sit down and interview Hillary Rodham Clinton about the probity of her own financial affairs on behalf of the average working American? There's this enormous distance between the elites at the top of these networks and the viewers whose interests they're supposed to be representing every day.
I completely agree with that. I think he's right. He's onto something. I mean, I think the same thing goes to the big scuffle we saw a couple months ago between the White House and the press corps, when the press corps was like, we are supposed to be the ones giving the news, and the White House is like, well, we're releasing news directly to the public, so we don't really need the middleman. But I think there's another point here that I think is very, very important. There's a distinction between journalism and those who are news personalities. And the reason why I say that is because I don't consider myself to be a journalist, but I'm somebody who talks about the news, I commented on the news, and I'm a news personality. And there's a big distinction, right? Like, I don't have to necessarily, and I think as culture changes in the media world, I don't follow, I mean, I would be honest and say that I don't know all the rules of journalism, but my job is to commentate, and I never say that I'm a journalist ever.
Or make up stories about being in war zones, I'm sure. but there's a wider point here about media conglomerates too, aren't there? You know, Brian Williams was sort of cross-promoted. He was the newsreader, but he had his own show called 30 Rock. He was on late-night talk shows. As media companies grow in power and influence here in the US, do you think there's that tendency to try and make the newscaster a recognizable face, all things to all people?
Yeah, because I think they have to, and because I think they're now trying to compete in an environment that, frankly, the broadcast networks, don't understand. Those new media brands that Richard mentioned that are now filching viewers away from the broadcast networks. You can see the numbers for those 6:30 nightly news programs constantly diminishing. Those are brands that newsmakers like Barack Obama chooses to interact with, going over the top of the broadcast networks. He doesn't want to sit down and have a conversation with Brian Williams or Lester Holt or George Stephanopoulos when he can be talking to a teenager who reaches 8.2 million subscribers on YouTube, the project that I was involved with recently. I mean, this is a whole new arena. The broadcast networks are struggling to understand how to maintain relevance, and that's one of the reasons why they're putting personalities like Brian Williams out there down every pipe they can.
And yet we saw the public reaction was so visceral and so quick. So there still is this thing in the American psyche, is there not, that you have to trust your newsman. Do you think that, both of you, and Richard first, NBC actually handled this well after a stuttering start? I mean, they've suspended him for 6 months. They're showing that they believe that everything that comes out of his mouth should be true or verifiable.
Well, listen, let's take a couple steps back here, and I think you made this idea, the idea that the public was outraged by Brian Williams. And I almost argue that the public only became outraged about Brian Williams when his colleagues in the media became overtly outraged by Brian Williams. So the media, quote-unquote, conglomerates pushed the story, right? The public picked up the story, and then there was outrage, and I think NBC tried to react to it. But with that being said,
I don't know. On Twitter that night, I mean, all that Brian Williams misremembers stuff, they had him on the moon.
Yeah, but that didn't start. I don't think that started until the media started to push the story, right? And I think the media sort of his colleagues led to sort of his own demise a little bit there. But with that being said, I think there's an argument to be had that the network didn't handle it as well as they should have. I think, you know, either one, they could have chose, they have two avenues. They could have doubled down and said, listen, he lied, people make mistakes all the time, we're moving forward and we're keeping him, but he's going to suspend himself, then we're going to suspend him. That was a little bit messy, that was a little bit tricky, and I also believe that that is what led to sort of the drop in ratings that they had, and it gave Lester Holt a really hard time to sort of bring the ratings up, because he sort of got, you know, egg in his face for Brian Williams' mistake.
But he's doing quite well. Simon, now, NBC News is run by a former British television executive, the network you used to work for.
Former colleague of mine, yes.
That's right. She's had some problems at the network. Did she handle it right, and what are the lessons?
Well, I think that this is Deborah Turness, who's the president of NBC News, the former head of ITV News in the UK. I think she's obviously had an extremely challenging 12 months. This was not a problem of her creation. This was a problem of Brian Williams' creation, but it became ultimately a problem that Comcast, the owners of NBC, decided they were going to solve. And again, you can't divorce what's happened here from the money. Comcast has got $200 million of advertising revenue riding on the NBC Nightly News, as it was then called, with Brian Williams. This was a cold, hard, calculated financial decision that he was done, and I think he is done, isn't coming back, and they had to move on.
Well, we'll be back. Next, we'll discuss the mistakes made by the American press leading up to the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003. Stay with us on The Heat.